It is so good to see you guys. So good to see the balcony crew up there. So thankful that you're here. Let me remind you next week on February the 9th, which I think is Super Bowl Sunday, we're going to be doing what we're calling our big reveal, and we're going to show you what our building team and our elders and Derek Phillips and his crew at Deco Architects have been working on sort of behind the scenes for the last several months. We've got plans to add more seats and create some cool gathering spaces and make our building more accessible for everybody. So we're really excited to show you that. We'll be doing that in both services next week. So he'll take part of my time, which I know you're heartbroken about, and then I'll come in and try to answer any questions you might have. This is all part of the Promise campaign that we launched back in 2017 and part of our efforts to reach more people with the gospel. So come back next week, and we'll show you what we've been working on, and hopefully you can help us, and we'll talk about ways that you can help us next week. So just if you're in town, we'd love to see you next week. Now, if you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to turn to Revelation chapter 21. You'll find it near the back if you're using a paper copy. And while you're finding it, I want you to think about this question. What comes to your mind when you hear the word heaven? Or maybe a better way to ask it is, what do you think heaven is going to be like? Just keep that in the back of your mind. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but we are now living in a new world in terms of AI or artificial intelligence. Almost every day we read headlines about the capabilities of AI or warnings about the negative effects of AI. There was this past Monday, you may have noticed, the stock market dipped pretty dramatically when a Chinese company released a version of AI that's supposedly more advanced than American AI, and investors panicked. Experts say that we're underestimating just how disruptive artificial intelligence is going to be to multiple industries: education, finances, communications. It just goes on and on. But for now, most people, if they use it at all, they only use it to answer questions and to create images. And it's amazing how it works. Like, you can just type in a question or give it some sort of a prompt, and it, depending on which application you use, it will produce whatever it is you're looking for. So let me give you an example. I went this past week and I used one of the popular AI applications. Actually, I had somebody help me do it. And I said, here's a prompt. If you wanted to see a picture of Johnny Cash and George Washington singing a duet, here it is. Got a picture for it. There it is, right there. The father of our country and the man in black singing a duet. Let's just say, let me give you now, and this is totally random, okay? This is totally random. This means nothing. Let's just say you wanted to see Coach Cal dressed up like Elvis. Let's just see, could you do that? There it is. Again, totally random, not pointing out anything. Or what about this? Let's say you wanted to see Coach Cal dressed, and nobody's feeling better than Coach Cal today, by the way. Let's just say you want to see Coach Cal dressed as Elvis riding on a Razorback. Could you do that? Yeah, you could. So, I mean, you can put anything. You can. It's just mind-blowing what you can do. So the same time I was doing these, I asked this AI application, I said, I want you to draw me a picture or create an image of what most people think about when they think about heaven. Here's the image it came back with. And you think about that, and it's kind of got all the bases covered, right? There's a gate, there's an angel, there's like these rays of sunshine, there's some pretty flowers, and then there are these big fluffy clouds. Like, the only thing that's missing from that is a harp, right? And that's the vision. The details might differ from person to person, but that's the vision that a lot of people have whenever they think about heaven. We're all going to wear white robes, and we're going to be assigned a harp, and we're going to ride around on clouds for the rest of eternity. Or if you grew up in church, maybe the vision of heaven that you've lived with is like it's going to be one long, never-ending church service, right? And so, I Isaiah is going to go through the book of Isaiah, and it's going to take about 500 years. And then when he's done, the Apostle Paul is going to spend 700 years going through Romans, just word by word, verse by verse. Then when those guys get done, we're going to turn it over to Matthew, and Matthew's going to spend, 10,000 years going through the gospel. And in between all that, like, we'll get together. It's not going to be just, listen to somebody preach all the time. We're gonna sing some songs together. So we'll throw it back, to the Hebrew Psalms, and then we'll work our way up to the Gregorian chants of the Middle Ages, and then we'll get to the 1800s and some of the classic hymns, and we'll get to the 50s and 60s and some of the Southern gospel classics that our grandparents liked, and then eventually, about 10,000, maybe 15,000 years from now, we'll get to like the K-Love type songs. So there's going to be something for everybody. Now, if that's your vision of heaven, I don't mind telling you, that doesn't sound all that exciting, right? Like, if you think, if heaven is going to be, we're going to ride around on clouds and play harps, or if we're going to sit in a never-ending church service like for eternity, that doesn't sound all that compelling. I mean, even if you're a person who enjoys going to church, you're like, I don't know that I want to do that. I sat through some pretty long services when I was a kid, and I was thinking about this, like, there are weeks, especially in this first service, where if we go a little bit long, like, I get antsy, right? And it's usually my fault. And I'm like, can you imagine if you were in church for, like, not just 65 minutes, but like 65 million years? I think the reason most of us struggle when it comes to what we think about heaven is because we've inherited sort of this faulty view, or maybe this incomplete view of what it's actually going to be like. It's almost as if we viewed heaven, it's like it's the result of the gospel, but it's not really part of the gospel because we're not really sure what to think about. And so today, as part of our Gospel Revisited series, we've been focusing on not what we can do to make ourselves better, which is what we normally do in January. Instead, we're focusing on what God has done to make us new. And there's a part of this that we almost always leave out. And it's the part where the Bible teaches that God didn't just send his Son to make us new. He sent his Son to make everything new. I said again, there's a part of this that we often forget, that God did not just send Jesus to make us new, to turn us into a new creation, but to make everything new. And so as we conclude this series today, that's what I want us to focus on. It's the fact that from the very moment of Jesus' arrival on earth, which we celebrate at Christmas, he inaugurated this new kingdom with the goal of remaking the entire world. And so as you read through the Gospels, that's what you see Jesus do. Yes, he makes individuals new, but it's with the goal of making all things new. One writer, Greg Gilbert, said it like this. He said, step by step, blow by blow, Jesus was decisively rolling back the effects of the fall. The rightful king of the world had come, and all that stood in the way of the establishment of his kingdom, sin, death, hell, and Satan, was being decisively overcome. Now again, that's a process that started with his first coming and will be completed with his second coming. Now I know whenever you talk about the second coming of Christ, things tend to get weird, right? And we start to obsess over questions that can't be answered and symbols that can't seem to be deciphered. But for our purposes this morning, I want you to put all of that out of your mind, all the weird stuff that goes with this. And I want us instead to focus on why Jesus is coming back. Because of all the confusion, of all the debate that surrounds when he's coming and what that's going to look like, the one thing that's perfectly clear is why he's coming back in the first place. In Acts chapter 3, just a few weeks after the resurrection, after the ascension, remember, Jesus goes back to his Father in heaven. Angel shows up and says, one day in the future, he's going to come back. In Acts chapter 3, Luke, the writer of Acts, tells us why Jesus is coming back. In verse 21, he says this, heaven must receive him until the time comes for God now catch this part, until the time comes for God to restore everything, as he promised long ago through his holy prophets. So if you've been tracking with us, remember, the story of the gospel goes back to Genesis 1. God created this beautiful garden, the Garden of Eden. He put the first man and the first woman in the garden, and he gave them access to everything they could ever possibly need. And then it says that even better than that is that God himself would come down in the cool of the day, and he would just hang out with them. They related to God as you would relate to a friend. It's this picture of this unbroken intimacy with God. That's how it started. And then you get to Genesis 3, Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman, made the decision to do it their way instead of God's way. And when they did, they introduced a whole flood of negative consequences on themselves and on the world around them. We call it the fall of man. And the picture that the New Testament writers paint is that when Jesus comes back the second time, he is going to undo everything that went wrong. One way to say it is he's going to undo everything that's been undone because of sin. He's going to completely reverse all the effects of the fall. That's why in Luke 3:21, Luke tells us that when Jesus comes back, he is going to restore everything. So rather than coming back to earth on a rescue mission, which is, it's partly right, but it's incomplete, he's coming back to complete this long, hello there, he's coming along this, he's coming to complete this millennia-long restoration project. It started with his first coming. It'll end with his second coming. In theology, it's called the consummation of all things. It's the promise that at some unknown and unknowable point in the future, Jesus is literally going to return to earth, and when he does, he will conclude making all things new. So it's not just a rescue mission, it's a restoration project. He's going to restore everything. And so you get to the book of Revelation. By the time the Apostle John sits down to write this, he is a really old man who has been exiled to the island of Patmos. By now, it's been about 30 years since the resurrection, since Jesus ascended back to his Father. It's been 60 years since the resurrection. It's been 30 years since Peter and Paul and most of his contemporaries have been martyred. And it's been about 25 years since the city of Jerusalem had been destroyed. And so as he looks around at what's going on around him, he is literally the last man standing. He's the last of the apostles. The church is suffering under intense persecution. Nothing is as if he thought it would be. And it's while he's on this island, while it feels like the world is falling completely apart, that God gives him a glimpse of what it's going to be like, a vision of what it's going to be like when Jesus returns and commences to restore everything. So if Genesis 3 is kind of the picture of paradise lost, then Revelation 21 is the picture of paradise regained. And one of the things that makes this so hard to understand, though, and if you grew up in church, you know this, the language that John uses throughout the book of Revelation is so symbolic that sometimes it's hard to know exactly what he's talking about. Sometimes you read that and it kind of leaves you scratching your head. But so for our purposes this morning, rather than getting all caught up in that and what's unclear, I want to focus on three things that are clear about what's going to happen when Jesus becomes. And he paints this picture of paradise regained. It's this picture of heaven on earth. So if you have your Bible open, I want you to look at this with me. Chapter 21, verse 1. Here's what it says. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. You're tracking with us. Here's the first thing John tells us about what's going to happen when Jesus returns. He said it will be a repaired creation. Now, in the Greek language, there are two words that can be translated into our English word new. The first one indicates that something is new in terms of time, in that it's never existed before. So it's just new. It didn't exist and now it exists. The other word, though, describes something that's new, not in terms of time, but in terms of its quality. So, for example, if you remodeled your kitchen, you would say you've got a new kitchen. Now, it's not new in that it never existed before, but it's new in terms of its quality. It's been repaired or restored. And so what's interesting about this is that when John has to choose between those two words, he uses the second of those two words. So somehow he's saying that this new heaven and this new earth is going to be like a repaired version or a restored version of the first heaven and the first earth. So what he's saying is that rather than heaven, make sure you get this, rather than heaven looking like a bunch of like disembodied spirits riding around on clouds and playing harps to one another, the way he words it, he indicates that heaven is going to be like what life on earth was originally designed to look like. We will be living in a restored version or a repaired version of what he originally intended. It's going to look a lot more like Genesis 1 than what most of us have wrapped our minds around. That's why when you get to verse 2, he describes it in terms of a city. He calls it the New Jerusalem. And he says something really interesting. He says this New Jerusalem, this new city, is going to come down to us. Now, most of the time we think about heaven, what do we talk about? We talk about somebody going up to heaven. But the way John pictures it, he said heaven is going to be something that comes down to us. Revelation 21, the great writer N.T. Wright explains it like this. He said, the great drama will end not with saved souls being snatched up into heaven, away from the wicked earth and the mortal bodies which have dragged us down into sin, but with the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven to earth, so that the dwelling of God is with humans. And so it'll be like this restored version of what it was always supposed to be like. It'll be like this vision of Genesis 1 in which we're with God and he's with us. So it's much more than just like this rescue mission. I mean, that's part of it. He's coming to rescue us, but it's much more a restoration project in which he's going to make us new and make everything around us that's been undone by sin new. So to help us wrap our minds around what this is going to be like, John goes on throughout the rest of this chapter and into the next chapter, and he gives us a partial list of things that won't be in heaven. So, for example, first he says there'll be no sea. Now, on earth, what do seas do? They divide people from one another. But in heaven, he says you'll have people from every tribe, every nation, every tongue, all living as one members of one family. Then in verse 22, he says there'll be no more churches or no more temples. Why is that? Because we'll already be in God's presence. God will be with us and we will be with him. Verse 23 says there'll be no sun or no moon because God himself will provide all the light we need. Revelation 22 goes on. He talks about how all the effects of the curse will be absent from heaven. There'll be no more stress about how to pay the bills, no more anxiety about, are the crops going to come in this year? Is this thing going to sell? None of that. No more relational tension. One writer said, in the New Jerusalem, there'll be no more unemployment, no picket lines, no police, no politicians, no doctors, no lawyers, no preachers, no prisons, no hospitals, no IRS, no ICE, no CIA, no FBI, no locks, no light bulbs, no weddings, no funerals, and no armies. You think it'll be this restored version of what life was always supposed to look like. And yet, as good as all that sounds, if you're anything like me, the thing that probably most captured your attention is what he said in verse 4. When he said, he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. A couple weeks ago, I was listening to this speaker who I've known for a long time, and he's getting ready to turn 65. And so as part of his talk, he was talking about some things, I forget what the title was, he was talking about some things that he learned from age 40 to age 65. And since I'm 41, I kind of, set up straighter. And he started talking about, and he described something that I can relate to, and you probably can relate to it too. He said like this. He said when he was in his 20s, he could go out and play basketball deep into the night, get up the next morning, and go to work with no problem. Like, you remember those days, Davo? Yeah, I do too. Then he said in his 30s, he would go out and play basketball with his buddies deep into the night, and the next morning he'd get up and go to work, and guess what happened? Sore. I have to kind of hobble in. Then he said, this is where it hits kind of close to home for me. He said, then, when I hit my 40s, I would get up in the morning, and I was sore, and I didn't do anything the night before. Like, I didn't play basketball. I didn't even walk anywhere. And then it got worse, and he said, then into my 50s, and now into my 60s, it doesn't matter because I lay down to go to sleep, and I can't sleep because I keep having to get up to go to the bathroom. And like somebody, like you're like, yeah, I can see how this is a problem. And then he made this statement that I thought was so profound. He said, I've learned as I get older that we tend to measure life as a long series of losses. So again, he said, I've learned as I get older, that we tend to measure life as a long series of losses. And you know how it works because you've experienced it. You lose your grandparents, then you lose your parents. Some of you have lost a mate. Some of you have lost a child. You lose your hair. Hearing starts to go. Your vision's not as sharp as it once was. Your mobility is not what it used to be. And there are things now that you can't do that you used to do. And maybe even your memory's getting a little foggy. And you realize that the future's going to be different than the past. One writer said, we are not in the land of the living going to the land of the dying. We are in the land of the dying going to the land of the living. There's a sense as you get a little older, the losses start to pile up. It doesn't look like it used to look. And yet the picture that Revelation 21 paints is that at some point in the future, we're going to get all of that we've lost back. And even more than that, it says that we will have resurrected bodies living in a repaired creation. I love the way the great writer J.R.R. Tolkien put this. He wrote the the Lord of the Rings. He said this, he said, the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus means that one day everything sad will come untrue. But even that's not the best part. You keep reading this chapter, and here's something else that he tells us about heaven. It's that we will experience unbroken intimacy with God. So you go back to verse 3. It says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. So I've got a picture I want to show you. I don't know. Last Sunday morning, right before daylight, there was a group of students, you can see them there, a part of them there, who are enrolled in the sports management program at Mount St. Mary's University. They showed up at the stadium to prepare. They were volunteer workers helping the NFL prepare for that afternoon's playoff game between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Buffalo Bills. I know many of you watched the game. And I don't know if you keep up with this. You may not be in tune, with who's dating who in the pop culture world. But one of the Chiefs players, Travis Kelce, is dating the pop singer Taylor Swift. She's like the biggest star in the world. So if you watch the game, it's almost impossible to watch the game because every 15 or 20 seconds, the cameras will pan to Taylor Swift and show her reaction to the play instead of showing the play she's reacting to. It's all about her reactions. And so these students were there early. Right before she came out, they're in the tunnels underneath the stadium, right? And they're going to their next assignment where they're supposed to be working, and this elevator pops open, and out steps with her security detail, right? And so they see her. They're all just sort of standing there staring at her. And to her credit, she stopped and offered to take a picture with them. And so the picture was posted on social media. The student newspaper, got wind of it. And so when the students got back to campus, they interviewed the students who had met Taylor Swift. And they said, when you signed up to work this game, did you think you would have any chance at all of meeting Taylor Swift? And here's what one of them said. She said, I felt like the closest we would get to her was like seeing her on the Jumbotrons or even just scoping the suites out to see which one she was in. But we never imagined being inches away from her. Now, I want you to keep that in mind. I think that's the kind of concept, the kind of picture that a lot of people have whenever they think about going to heaven with God. Yeah, he's going to be there, right? But we're not going to get close to him. I mean, we might see him on the Jumbotron, if he has to make an announcement. We might see him from a distance, but he's going to have all these security guys guarding the throne room. There's not going to be any chance for anybody like us to get to him. And yet when you read what John actually says about this new heaven, this new earth, he says you're going to be with him. So rather than being like this king who's protected by the Secret Service or whatever, you're going to be invited to sit at his table. You're going to relate to him like he's your father inviting you home rather than he's some dignitary that you can't get to. That's why later on in Revelation 22, verse 4, John says, they will see his face and his name will be on their foreheads. Now, to see somebody's face, you got to get pretty close to them. You can see their silhouette, but to see their face, you got to be right there with it. If you go back to Genesis chapter 1, the Bible tells us that when Adam and Eve were created, that God himself would come down in the cool of the day and he would hang out with them. They would see his face and they would talk to him. And then Genesis 3 happens, and all of a sudden this intimacy that we were created for is broken. So now there's this distance between us and God. And even though it's hardwired into our DNA to want to be close to him, we can never seem to figure out how to bridge that distance. We can never bridge that gap. And we might have moments, you might have fleeting moments, where it feels like you're extra close to him, but it's usually not long until that distance starts to creep back in. And yet Revelation 21 says that when he returns, we will be with him. That distance will be closed forever, and we'll have this intimacy with him that we were created to experience in the first place. And so the best part of heaven is not that we'll be there. It's that he'll be there. That's one more thing you see in this passage. And that's that when this day comes, whenever he comes back, we'll receive our promised inheritance. Now I know you read this, there's a part of, if you're like me, you read this and kind of like one of those fairy tales that everybody lives happily ever after. You think, that's cool, but I don't know that I believe it. I think God knew that. So when you get to verse 5, God speaks for only the second time in the entire book. And I want you to look at what he says. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy, true. It's almost as if God says, I know this sounds too good to be true. I know this sounds, and I know when you look around at what's going on in your life and what's going on in the world, I know you don't see any evidence that this is ever going to happen, but I want you to know that I am going to fulfill my promise. And then you get to verse 6, and he just reiterates the promise. He said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. The question we started with is, what do you think heaven is going to be like? And the truth is, there's a lot of things we don't know, and even if we did know, like, we wouldn't have the language to describe them. Earlier in 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul's given just the briefest glimpse of heaven, and he comes back and he says, everything I saw there was inexpressible. Like, he didn't even have the words to describe what he'd seen. But there are some things that we do know, just hints that John drops. For example, we know there's going to be like delicious food in heaven. It's all calorie-free and, low cholesterol. We don't have to worry about any of that. We know there's going to be this refreshing water, incredible scenery. The picture John paints, heaven is going to be a place of rest, a place of service, a place of worship. We know heaven's going to give us an opportunity to reconnect with our old friends and family that have gone on. It's going to be a place where we can initiate some new relationships. I mean, all those things are clear, but as far as the details as how all that's going to work, we really don't know. But here's what we do know. Whatever it looks like, it's not going to be boring. Verse 7, John says that those who are victorious will inherit all this. So I got a picture I want to show you. Just keep in mind, this was not taken last night. This is Pope's first road game he won at Kentucky. And so the way I kind of envision this, and again, you're kind of stretching because all these things are inexpressible. I think heaven's going to look more like a winning locker room than riding around on clouds. I think it's going to look more like a team that just won a big game than sitting in a never-ending church service. So yeah, there's going to be some high fives and some hugs and some dancing, because he says that it's going to be for those who are victorious, those who have won, those who have been welcomed into this place that they never imagined they would actually get to. And so rather than being like clouds and church services and all of that, I think it's going to be more like a never-ending celebration. And you go from the locker room celebration to the parades. I think that's a better picture than most of us have. There's a writer named Randy Alcorn, great writer, probably written more about heaven than any other individual. I want you to listen to how he described it. He said, to be in resurrected bodies, on a resurrected earth and resurrected friendships, enjoying a resurrected culture with the resurrected Jesus. Now that will be the ultimate party. Everybody will be who God made them to be, and none of us will ever suffer or die again. As a Christian, the day I die will be the best day I've ever lived. But it won't be the best day I ever will live. Resurrection Day will be far better. And the first day on the new earth, that will be one big step for mankind and one giant leap for God's glory. I don't know about you, but that sounds like something I can look forward to. That sounds a lot better than playing the harp and going to a church service, no matter who's preaching and how good the band is. But before I close, there's one more verse in this passage, and I want to read you, and I'm going to tell you up front, it's going to make you uncomfortable. But I wouldn't be honest with you if I didn't read you this part. It's verse 8. I want you to listen to what John says. But, kind of a big but right there. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is second death. As incredible as the picture that he paints of heaven is, he makes it clear that not everybody's going. Now, I know in our culture, we like to pretend that everybody that dies who wasn't like Hitler, goes to heaven, right? But that's not what Scripture teaches. In fact, Scripture seems to indicate that there'll be more people who don't go than who do. He says there's this narrow path and there's this broad road. And what makes verses like verse 8 so uncomfortable is you read through that, and it's very likely that at least one of those words, or maybe even a combination of those words, could be used to describe you. Maybe you're the one that's cowardly, unbelieving, a murderer, sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, those who are idolaters or dishonest. And so I just want you to know, if any of those terms apply to you, and my suspicion is they could probably all apply to most of us at some level, is it doesn't have to be like that. Because verse 6 says there is this fountain. He calls it the water of life that you can drink from that's free. And the reason it's free is because Jesus already paid for it. And so if you get to verse 8 and you think, man, I'm not sure I'm going to be on the list of people who get to experience all this cool stuff that John just described. Like, if that's where you find yourself, you don't have to stay there. You can be welcomed in his family, not because of what you've done, but because of what he's done on your behalf. You can drink from the fountain of life because of what Jesus did. So I want you to stand with me. We're going to sing a couple songs. If you're here and you'd like to pray with somebody, you have questions about where you fit into any of this, what this would look like for you, David's here, I'm here. We'd be honored to try to help you figure it out. Maybe you're here and you're ready to join the team here at First Christian. We'd be honored to have you. If you need to make a decision, you meet us on this front row. We'll do everything we can to help you.